Okay, so this is our program for the week of June 16th, 2025. Samer, I will bring you up in a second. It would be great to kind of just through certain things before we get started. We are just a few hours away from a UN Security Council meeting that was taking place this morning to discuss the emergent and dangerous hot war that's been developing between Israel and Iran. The U.S. ambassador was present and blamed Iran for the current escalation, saying it could have taken steps with regard to its nuclear program to avoid it. The Iranian ambassador called the attacks on the Iranian nuclear facility violations by Israel of UN resolutions that govern the safety of such facilities, and of course attacked Israel's credibility as a violator of human rights and an occupying power that is enabled by the US. And the Israeli ambassador accused Iran of attempting to assassinate the president of the United States and plotting to kill Israeli citizens across the globe, saying at one point that Iran had a genocidal plan and had come to the UN with, quote, innocent blood dripping from its hands, looking for sympathy. Needless to say, this is a continuation of the inflammatory rhetoric we've been seeing around this current aspect of a series of conflicts in the region without a clear avenue for de-escalation. And when conditions in Gaza grow more dire by the minute, it's pretty hard to make sense of it all. So we're really fortunate to have you with us today to do some distillation of that. But I'm wondering, what's some of what you'll be covering today, and some of your reactions to this current UN meeting and the alleged talks in Geneva that have been ongoing with European leaders around this situation.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. It's always great to be here. There's so much. This week in particular, I feel like I think obviously the news always weighs heavy, but it's rare for me to wake up every single day like at 2 or 3 in the morning and just be like, World War III? Just got to check real quick. Are we in World War III? No? Okay, can go back to sleep. I think that feeling is probably quite prevalent right now, like around the world. So, in terms of, the UN and these like Europe talks, yeah, I think it's a sort of running commentary on the PSAs about the inefficacy of those kinds of institutions and how they really totally fail to produce any meaningful change. I don't think we can expect to see diplomatic efforts, either at the UN or, these sort of like European side conversations to really result in any material changes, unfortunately. I think the actors involved are going to be the ones that hash it out, and it's going to be, that can go a few different ways, and we'll obviously get into the details there and sort of the underlying incentives of the different actors. But right now, I would say the range of outcomes is almost unimaginably wide.
Yeah, and I just wanted to I had this slide up because this was the Al Jazeera news tracker from this morning, and just if folks are having trouble keeping track of how this pendulum is swinging, and also whether or not they should take seriously the fact that nuclear facilities are involved and that at least one party, which has nuclear weapons, and potentially two if the US gets involved, are standing on the precipice of something potentially dangerous. If you just look at some of the minute by minute, blow by blow updates here, it starts with the most recent, this was at, probably closer to 9 a.m. Eastern here, but, Iran saying that the Geneva talks were respectful and serious, but not the end of diplomacy, and that it would not be inconceivable that it would deal would reach to the IRGC, talking about their, flexing their muscle about their missile power. Erdogan weighing in and saying the Iran conflict is reaching a point of no return. The U.S. envoy slamming Iran, obviously in that meeting that happened this morning with the Security Council and other attacks from Israel. So it's a pendulum right now that is swinging pretty violently back and forth, and it's very difficult, I think, for lay folks to make sense of it as we are trying our best to do. But we appreciate all the insights you're able to give us today, and looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us and the breakdown of the many items of news from across the region this week. So thanks again.
Yeah, it's yeah, really excited to get into it though. As a fellow lay folk, I think I'm also struggling along with everybody else, but we'll do what we can to make sense of a moment that is totally nonsensical.
And Sammer, why don't you
Um,
share your slides again? Because I think I'm realizing that your whatever you shared last is not showing up. So let me wait till you share
oh,
it.
sure, one second. That work?
Yeah, perfect. Floor is yours.
Thanks, Noise. Okay, jumping right in because there's a lot to cover this week. So, not sure we'll get through it all, but we'll do what we can. Obviously starting with Gaza as always, just because I think there's a lot of attention has been pulled away from Gaza this past week, given everyone freaking out about what's happening with Iran. And as always, Israel uses that as a opportunity to expand some of its offensives. We've seen some horrific violence in Gaza this past week. The usual sort of 100+ casualties per day, most of which are in aid lines. And we'll get into some of the aid massacres in a little bit. But just to say the sort of new-ish looming catastrophe on the horizon in Gaza is this upcoming threat of drought as we enter into these summer months. Um, this isn't particularly new. We know that there has been a systematic assault on the water infrastructure in Gaza, right? Israel has bombed almost, the most of the water treatment facilities in Gaza are no longer functioning because they've been attacked by Israel, again, with no real justification, right? Not like, oh, there's a terror base hiding under this water treatment plant, right? They just blow up the water treatment plants with no explanation per usual. And in addition to that, what we saw a couple of years ago and last year that's really starting to come back is the large-scale attempts by the Israeli military to pump seawater into like onto Gazan land, ostensibly to flood the tunnels, even though everyone knew that wasn't actually an effective strategy to deal with the tunnels under Gaza. But what it did do is it salinated a lot of Gaza's water reservoirs. So the drinking water that used to be available in Gaza is no longer available ever, right? Like the reservoirs have been ruined by the pumping of the seawater in. So some real catastrophes there that we're starting to see the impact of. And we've talked about this on PSAs going back a very long time. So you can always go back if you want more information on the attack on water infrastructure in Gaza. But in terms of the military assaults that have been happening this past week, there have been quite a few. They've been really intense. Some days nearing 200 killed by Israeli forces in specific areas in Gaza. Again, mostly under the cover of people not really paying attention to what's happening there. Um, the like a big piece of that is, of course, the aid massacres, where we're seeing near 100 people every single time there is an aid distribution being gunned down by Israeli forces and their proxies while waiting for aid. And some of you may have seen the videos around this, just bone chilling, absolutely bone chilling, hearing from people who are like, there's no other way to feed my family, and every time I go there, I feel like I'm target practice for the Israeli soldiers. Um, and they don't have a choice, and they keep going back. Often for aid, by the way, that can't be used in ways that, we talked about last week on the PSA that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is distributing aid that food aid that cannot be utilized by Gazans because it's dry goods that need to be cooked with gas that isn't allowed to be let in. It's worth noting, that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is denying that these things are happening, despite the fact that there's video footage of those massacres happening in those areas. And the Israeli military is denying that they're the ones who are responsible for the killings, blaming them on, militias or sometimes on Hamas. But again, you can watch video footage where Palestinians are being massacred by tank fire at some of these distribution areas, and like, there's nobody else in Gaza with tanks, obviously. So a real horror show here, and um, you're you're particularly in a situation where, and given the sort of scrutiny on the GHF, in the ways that we've been talking about for a while now, even if this wasn't intentional, it is a more or less unavoidable consequence of the lack of thoughtful logistics of these aid distribution areas. At the moment, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has 4 distribution sites in Gaza. I think they're expanding that to 6 this week, but I'm not sure. And that means 4 distribution sites for 2 million people. So that's 500,000 people per distribution site. Like, given the sort of crush of people that would need to be present at any of these places, like it's inconceivable that that wouldn't end up being the case. So we're seeing some, uh, uh, again, this like, I don't know whether this is on purpose because again, we don't know who's funding the GHF. Um, we know that it's receiving a lot of money from the Israeli government, but it's so opaque in its leadership and its, underlying objectives and things that we don't really have a sense of whether it's just completely incompetent or it's specifically designed to further this ethnic cleansing project. And the more it goes on, the more I think we lean towards the latter. The other really important aid development that happened this week as we sort of continue down this path of, the collapsing liberal international order is we're seeing not only in Gaza, but around the world, the role of this sort of humanitarian aid distribution being taken up by military contractors, so like private mercenary forces, as opposed to like actual aid organizations. So that's obviously happening in Gaza, but we're seeing it happen in a number of locations in Africa as well, where private for-profit military organizations are now the ones that are managing a lot of the aid delivery, who obviously don't know how to do it, aren't trained in actual humanitarian response. And of course, when the slightest thing goes wrong, everything turns into a bloody massacre, unsurprisingly. So, yeah, the dynamics there are just really, really terrifying. And again, a natural consequence of, once again, I feel like this running theme that we have on the PSAs of the ways in which Israel's assault on global norms has resulted in these like new realities in the way that the whole world works, right? In terms of expectations for how things operate. And we're seeing that, of course, not just in Palestine, but in all of these other spots. Um, the last thing I wanted to touch on specific to like the dynamics on the ground in Gaza is, of course, the ongoing Gideon's Chariots campaign, this Israeli assault that's designed to, in their words, totally control Gaza. Um, it's worth noting just like the level of strategic failure that's underlying all of these command and control operations. We talk about frequently how effective the IDF is at killing people, but how terrible it is at actually like holding territory. We're continuing to see IDF casualties in areas that are supposedly not only like recently brought into Israeli control, but areas that the Israelis have now been controlling for months, quote unquote controlling, just to show that this idea of like control over the area is really just kind of an elaborate political fiction. At the same time, just this week, actually just last Saturday, specifically on one day, throughout that day, like in the morning and in the evening, there were rockets fired from Gaza into southern Israel. Again, sort of like, you know, the Israeli military has been there for 2 years almost. It's completely destroyed all of Gaza's infrastructure, and people on the ground, it may or may not be Hamas. It might be one of the other armed groups there. We don't really have any sense. Um, is still capable of firing rockets into Israel. So again, just to show that this like security theater doesn't really get to the endpoint that they're describing it as. Like, you cannot bomb Gaza enough for these things to stop happening. So what the end game is here for Gideon's Chariots is sort of anybody's guess. We always touch on the ceasefire negotiations in Gaza a little bit. There isn't really a whole lot to say this week relative to previous weeks, but there have been just a couple of dribbles of articles actually about ceasefire negotiations picking up again in the context of what's happening with Israel's war on Iran. There seem to be some new dynamics here, but we hear that constantly, right? Like every few weeks, we hear from either Israeli or U.S. officials saying, "Oh yeah, actually, an agreement's right around the corner." And we don't know anything about what's in these new dynamics, but the only thing that's really of note here is um, that the Israeli official that's quoted this week saying that, like, okay, actually, we think things are moving along in the ceasefire is that they said that in their words, the scope of negotiations has been significantly broadened, and it's now about ending the war. So, like, for the first time, we're hearing, well, maybe not for the first time, but possibly, we're hearing Israelis actually talk about negotiations that could lead to a military withdrawal. I wouldn't hold my breath. I don't think it's very likely, but the fact that those conversations are even happening, I think, are interesting in their own right. Um, and then just moving over to the West Bank, a few things here. One, I really just highly recommend that folks read this article from the Baffler about the annexation of the West Bank and basically how that process has really accelerated in the past couple of years. Not only do I think it gets into a lot of really good detail about like what specifically has happened and how, like the far right settler movement has been sort of planning for this and, like laid out a plan and that things are sort of moving along on that plan. But a really critical piece of this that I feel like sometimes gets lost in the mix is that we spend a lot of time talking about Smotrich, the Israeli minister that's behind a lot of the West Bank annexation work, but uh, this article really gets into how the underlying political structure of Israeli government, right? Not like the particular politicians who happen to occupy a particular seat, but the underlying governance structures are basically locked into an annexationist framework. And it's going to, like it's not about the Netanyahu government, it's baked in. And it's going to take a massive political change for that process to be interrupted or stopped. Um, and like it gets into how that happens. So yeah, would definitely recommend giving that a read. And in the context of that, again, per usual, we always touch a little bit on the raids, the displacements, the attacks, the settler violence and whatever that continues to sort of escalate in the West Bank, and the ways, by the way, and the Baffler article gets into this, the ways that that's sort of become state policy now, and they're sort of pushing for increased settler violence as a way to kind of advance their interests extrajudicially. In Europe, we talked about this at the top, so I won't spend too much time on it, but just to say that, like this attempted meeting between EU countries and Iran, trying to figure out if there was a way out of this particular impasse doesn't seem to have really moved anywhere meaningful. Last week we talked about how the previous week we talked about the like lack of really meaningful anything coming out of Europe beyond sort of like discursive condemnations of what's happening. And we saw, I think, in very stark clarity this week, the ways that Israel's attack on Iran was met with basically no condemnation from Europe, the unprovoked illegal attack. And then Iran's response to the unprovoked illegal attack, like, spawned all of this, like, oh, Israel has a right to defend itself kind of nonsense from European states, which, like, okay, so Iran doesn't have a right to defend itself, and Israel has a right to defend itself against retaliations from unprovoked illegal attacks that it makes. Like, it just, the thinnest of pretexts, if you can even call it that. In Yemen, a couple of things to note. One, they're starting to do an analysis of what that, set of like Trump-led bombings of Yemen that produced nothing, resulted in, and like the casualty rate is just really, really terrifying. Apparently, just those like 2 months of bombings that Trump ordered on Yemen killed as many civilians as the past 23 years of attacks that the US has made on Yemen, and there have been no shortage, right? Including Biden for a year and a half and Obama's extrajudicial drone strikes and whatnot. And, as a reminder, right, like those attacks led to an agreement between the Houthis and the United States that basically restored the status quo as it was right before, which is they continue attacking ships and they continue to attack Israel. And so, like, it accomplished literally nothing other than killing a lot of people in Yemen. A good thing to remember as folks think about what's going to happen in Iran potentially in the coming weeks. The other thing is, of course, Iran is continuing to fire ballistic missiles. This at a time where, of course, if Iran is firing them and Yemen is coordinating with Iran, um, the fact that both of those countries are operating in tandem for this sort of ballistic missile attack is really important in ways that we'll come back to. We'll sort of talk about the long-term strategies here and how they might play out. But in Lebanon, what we have not seen are any of these like long-range missile attacks, right? And this had historically, of course, been a key part of the Iranian deterrent policy, right? The strategy here was that Hezbollah was described as like a gun to the head of the Israeli state because it had this like massive missile arsenal. And of course, the dynamics of Israel's invasion of Lebanon and the tenuous slash regularly broken ceasefire um, that happened in Lebanon, I think obviously plays a huge role here. Like Hezbollah doesn't have the capability that it would have had a year ago to do that sort of defensive posturing. At the same time, I think it's really important to recognize that is a strategic calculation being made by the various parties, and that dynamic could change very quickly. Um, Hezbollah has very likely lost the majority of its ballistic missile capability, but remember that it had one of the largest stockpiles on Earth, and it still has a very significant ballistic missile capability. And so I can imagine a circumstance where dynamics change such that it will, in fact, start to use those. And we could see that actually going in two different directions here. We can imagine a situation where things are looking particularly bad for Iran and they're sort of being held in reserve in case they need them for that moment. So, like, say, a US strike, or conversely, right? If the war is leaning more towards the Iranian side, then that could also sort of open the gate, I think, for tactical military moves from Hezbollah. So just to say that this is like a line is relatively quiet. Lebanon continues to be bombed by Israel on a weekly basis, but could easily become a new flashpoint if things continue to accelerate. Syria, on the other hand, is now basically just being used as Israeli airspace. Like the fact that Israeli jets and bombers are just openly accessing Syrian airspace for their attacks on Iran, I think really speaks to the new reality there. But the other thing I think that's also important to note, and this is like in the context of uh, the new Syrian government trying to cozy up to Western interests to get sanctions relief, to open up the banking system back up in Syria. The first international bank transfer in years happened this week in Syria. And so this is all obviously part and parcel of that, right? So it's like Syria playing nice with the West and Israel. And a part of that is, of course, acquiescing to the use of Syrian territory for Israel's war on Iran. At the same time, the U.S. continues to maintain a pretty broad military presence in Syria. Trump this week announced a pretty significant drawdown of Syrian troops, partly, I think, because the understanding that if things get spicier with Iran, then those troops remain in serious jeopardy. But like, even in the current dynamics, U.S. army bases are being attacked in Syria, and there still remains a military. There will, until they're forced out, right? Like any Trump withdrawal of troops doesn't mean that he's getting rid of a U.S. military presence. It just means that there will be fewer soldiers on the ground, and that obviously the risk of like U.S. soldiers getting killed in this conflict, of course, sort of like the curve of escalation that implies. Um, is something that we again have to think about as we analyze the broader dynamics here and what could occur if things sort of start to get out of control. And so that's our loop around the region, and now we can focus on where we really need to focus this week, of course, which is Iran, and what's been happening this past week. The Israeli attacks on Iran started last Friday, literally like I think a few hours before the PSA started. So we didn't have a whole lot of time to analyze what was going on there. Now we've got a much better sense of what the underlying dynamics here are and what sort of led to this moment, although there's a ton that's still unknown. So we're just trying to figure out what we can figure out given the information that we have. Um, Firstly, this Al Jazeera article I think does a pretty good job of getting into the basics of um, where this attack came from and why it's happening. I don't think anyone on this call needs to hear from me that the pretense that this was about Iran's nuclear weapons is obviously just total nonsense, just absolute and utter nonsense. Not only was U.S. intelligence and this was like said publicly by Tulsi Gabbard just a couple months ago. The U.S. intelligence assessment is that Iran has no current plans to develop nuclear weapons, is not currently developing nuclear weapons, doesn't have the capability to be building nuclear weapons, but has enriched uranium that could, if they ever decided to start a weapons program, potentially be enriched enough to one day potentially create nuclear weapons. But that's like literally every state that's using nuclear energy, right? So all the signatories to the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, did I say that? The NPT basically allows any country to enrich uranium up to the level that it needs to be used for energy and research purposes, which is very low. It's like 3 or 4%. Um, and bans the use of that technology for the development of weapons. Iran is a signatory to that non-proliferation treaty. Israel is not, right? And Israel has secret nukes that nobody can check. There's no like, standards, whatever. The thing that did happen, is that Iran has increased the level of enrichment of the uranium that it has beyond the level that's needed for energy purposes. So obviously that raised some flags. But again, the reason that those flags were raised and the reason that they were raised very quickly is that Iran is filled with international observers and atomic energy, monitors who are allowed full access to these facilities. So like they are a signatory of this process. In the context of that, Israel has been saying literally basically every year for the past 32 years that Iran is right on the edge of developing a nuclear weapon. This little chart right here shows like all the times Netanyahu specifically has claimed that Israel is right about to develop a nuclear weapon in the timeline that he says Israeli intelligence estimates that the nuclear weapon will be ready by. And yeah, it's literally been going on since 1992, and it's always just a couple of years away, and somehow it never happens, obviously. And again, just to note here, in case folks don't know, like the Supreme Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran, issued a fatwa against nuclear weapons in 2003, saying that the development of nuclear weapons is strictly forbidden. And that, obviously is a diplomatic ploy in a certain way, but like it is official state policy to not develop nuclear weapons. Like it could not be further from the thing. In the context of all of that, Israel is just kind of broadly interested in Iranian regime change, right? They see Iran as like the big counterweight to Israeli hegemony over the region and a threat to Israel's status as the only nuclear power in the Middle East. So I think there's just a desire there, obviously, and we got into some of the other reasons last week around Netanyahu trying to stave off a no confidence vote in the parliament, and like this need for perpetual war to keep his coalition in power. And it seems like a little bit of pulling the United States into a war that they didn't want. And this is a particularly important piece here, I think, because we're hearing so much conflicting information about the role of the United States in this attack, and Trump this past week has been saying that he knew that the were planning to attack Iran all along, and that, like this whole game of negotiations and like, oh, Israel promised that they wouldn't attack during the negotiations was all a ruse that he was in on. And like maybe, it's not inconceivable that that's true, but I I wouldn't bet any money on it. Like I think that excuse is really, really thin. And if nothing else, like Trump isn't exactly known for that kind of like strategic long-term thinking. Like the man can only handle whatever is right in front of his face. Like, can you imagine him even holding a secret like that for multiple months? Like, there's no way. He'd be blurting it out all the time. I think a more realistic assessment of what actually happened here is that um, uh, Trump was made aware that the Israelis were planning to attack regardless of what the United States did, more or less. Obviously, Israel can never do anything without the tacit agreement of the United States. Um, and distanced himself from that attack. Like he okayed it. I think the word that you frequently hear is yellow light, right? Like he didn't green light it. He wasn't like, yeah, we support you doing this, but he didn't tell them to stop. And then waited, right? Like, immediately afterwards, there was all this crowing Western news coverage about, wow, what an incredible job the Israelis did. And he didn't like the fact that they were getting credit and he wasn't. And so they went very quickly from distancing themselves from that attack after realizing that maybe it was a good thing to being really on board with that attack. And now, like you hear Trump constantly being like, "We control Iran's airspace and whatever." Like, who's the we there, bro? So there's no question that they relied on U.S. intelligence. Obviously, they did it with equipment that the U.S. has given them. But the U.S. military, I don't think, is directly involved yet, and whether or not they will become involved, I think, is a really critical question right now. And that the answer to that, I think, is not super clear yet. But I think it will become increasingly clear in the coming week or so. And there's a lot, I think, there's some guideposts we have right now that help us assess whether or not that's going to happen. And I will say off the bat, and I could be 100% wrong about this. Everybody is reading tea leaves right now, but my guess is that it will not happen. And if it does happen, I think it'll be a very um, specific strategic strike and like one bombing, and that's it. But I don't even think that'll happen. But we'll see. Anyway, we'll come back to that. It's my teaser. So this New York Times article, I'm always loath to quote the New York Times given how awful their coverage has been generally. I think actually does a really good job of explaining that shift and how Trump sort of came around to supporting this Israeli attack and why he might be, so inclined to actually go through with the military strike at this moment. And one of the things that the article gets into is that like the U.S. intelligence was like, no, the Israeli intelligence on this is false. Like Israel is not, Iran is not in fact trying to build a bomb, and Trump just ignored it, right? Like, it wasn't convenient, I think, to his narrative for what he wanted in that moment. Um, but I think I would actually really recommend reading this article. They also did a daily podcast on it a couple of days ago that I think gets into it in pretty good detail. So if you want to understanding the dynamics, I actually think that's a pretty good starting place, weirdly enough. Don't quote me on that and don't subscribe to the New York Times. Um, so, I think um, there's a weird combo of things happening right now where Trump is simultaneously saying like we don't want a ceasefire, where there's no room for negotiations, total surrender or whatever. And at the same time, those negotiations are in fact actually still happening. There are new proposals being put on the table literally in the last day or so. And I think it's clear, I would surmise that what Donald Trump actually wants in this scenario is a deal, right? Like that's always his whole thing is that he wants deals. And I don't think he really actually understands like how that works or what it takes to make a deal. Um, and I think in his head, he thought that this limited Israeli attack would be so spectacular that it would force the Iranians into a weaker bargaining position, and they would take the offer that was currently on the table. And maybe just to take a second to explain what the offer on the table was and why it isn't working and where there might be some room in the future is it's really specifically around uranium enrichment, right? So it's not really even about the question of nuclear weapons because Iran has agreed. They're like, yeah, we don't want nuclear weapons. Um, the question is whether or not Iran, as guaranteed in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran wants to exercise that right to enrich its own uranium. And so the agreement that was made with Obama, the old Iran deal that Trump ripped up, basically agreed that Iran could enrich uranium up to 3% or whatever. And the new negotiations that were happening between Steve Witkoff and the Iranians were around that exact same dynamic. Like, okay, you can enrich uranium at 3% or so. Um, and Trump, we talked about this quite a bit last week. Trump, out of nowhere, was just like, actually, no, no, no enriched uranium, which like can't be a demand for a country that again has that right under the treaty that they signed. But basically, the offer from the United States was you can buy the uranium you need from other countries. And Iran was basically like, no, there's no way. That's not going to work for us. Like we have the right to enrich our own uranium. And we talked actually 2 weeks ago about a statement made by Ayatollah Khamenei, basically saying we're never going to give that up. And according to the New York Times, it was that statement actually that drove Trump off the rails and was just like, forget it. Okay, let's just okay the Israeli bombardment. Um, So this sticking point around uranium enrichment is the thing that needs to be resolved for the US to sort of come on board um, instead of a military option. And there seems to be some movement here. Uh, there's a proposal being floated right now for an international consortium to enrich uranium. Basically, like the Iranians teamed up with the Saudis and the Emiratis, and I think some other country would all be together enriching the uranium. It's not that weird, frankly, because there's a similar thing that happens in Europe with the UK, France, and Germany, who all collaborate in a consortium to enrich uranium. The question now is just where it would be. So Iran is like, yeah, let's do that. That's a great idea. We can do it in Iran. And the United States still doesn't want any uranium enrichment to happen inside Iranian borders. But like, if they can crack that piece, then actually, I think an agreement isn't that far off. So at the moment, Iran seems to be holding on, right? In the sense that based on that last proposal that the US submitted, Iran gave what they referred to as a polite no, meaning like they're clearly not backed into a corner in a way that Trump had hoped that they would be at this moment. And I think part of that is just that Iran has a higher pain threshold, maybe, than the US and Israel really gave it credit for. And where we're at now, I think, is this dynamic of, Iran sending these regular ballistic missile barrages into Israel, and Israel doing these regular, aerial and drone, whatever, attacks on Iranian infrastructure. Um, it seems like in this moment that this is a game of attrition. And it's particularly a game of attrition as it relates to Iran's ballistic missile stockpile and their missile launchers versus Israel's missile interceptors and the US's interceptors. So we don't really know how many ballistic missiles Iran has, obviously. Some estimates put it at around 3,000. I think they manufacture 300 or so of those long-range ballistic missiles every year. So they've definitely got quite a stockpile. We don't know how many have been like destroyed by Israeli attacks and whatnot. Um, we also don't have a great sense of how many interceptors Israel has. And, just to note here that like the Iron Dome is something people talk about a lot, but the Iron Dome actually isn't used to block these kinds of missiles. It doesn't work for this kind of thing. It's used for like local, like when Hamas launches things from Gaza or whatever. These are Arrow missile interceptors or David slings. They're like each interceptor costs like $2 or $3 million each missile that they launch. And the entire global production of those missiles is like 100 per year. So God knows how many they've burned through already. Um, and so this is the game, right? And this is why I think Iran is sending missiles in these like kind of staccato bursts. Um, and why, one could argue, we won't really know, but um, why some of those missiles are getting through, it might actually be because Israel is letting them through because it's being judicious about how many of its interceptors that it's using. So it's like keeping the number a little bit lower, which is why we might be seeing more like actual hits on Israeli ground. And just to say, the US is also intercepting and shooting down some of these missiles, but their supplies are also extremely low. Um, and like both of them have really depleted supplies because of the dynamics of this war for the past, 2 years, where from the Houthi missiles alone, uh, we understand that Israel has burned through a full year of its stockpile on these interceptors. So, right, this is the long game that Iran and its allies have been playing. And, that's the question, right? And that's why I think um, the dynamic right now is like the situation resolves itself in the next few days and or like a week or so because like that dynamic can't keep going on, right? Someone's going to run out. Iran's going to run out of missiles. Israel's going to run out of interceptors, and obviously whoever runs out is going to be in a really bad place. Um, and so like in the context of that, we have the Trump's announcement yesterday that he's going to make a decision about U.S. involvement in the next 2 weeks. And like they don't have 2 weeks, right? Like there's no way this thing can go on like this for 2 weeks. So I take that sort of as a sign that he might not want a U.S. direct military engagement here, despite all of the kind of like escalating rhetoric to the contrary. Again, could be 100% wrong about that. And this whole thing could be nonsense. And the US could actually start the bombardments literally 10 minutes after this call ends. Like we don't really know anything. Um, but you know, it's very telling, I think, that even now the assessment being made by the United States is that uh, uh, whether or not this period can lead to a negotiation on like the nuclear deal that avoids U.S. involvement. And the U.S. is aware that direct surrender is not on the table for Iran. Like it's just not in the cards. Nor is a total abandonment of their enrichment capacity, even now, right? According to this quote in the Times. And so um, that's the, like, described as the diplomatic needle that both sides need to thread. The U.S. accepts that Iran has a right to enrich uranium. Iran accepts that it must dismantle its nuclear program. That's like the tricky bit. Like where does that line get drawn? So I don't know. We'll see. In the meantime, though, it is worth noting that these 2 weeks also provide the United States military the ability to position a lot of its military assets in the region, so that if there were an escalation here, um, they would be better positioned to like attack Iran more forcefully. And sorry, just to maybe touch on this in case like it hasn't come up. The reason that the United States' military involvement in this is so critical is that, as we talked about last week, Israel is not capable of destroying Iran's nuclear capabilities by itself. And that's been a long-held assumption of the sort of like international security community. And these last few weeks have basically borne that out. There's one particular enrichment facility that's under a mountain. And so the Israelis just don't have the type of armament that's needed to knock out that facility. But the US has 30,000 pound bombs that have to be dropped by specific bombers. And so the big ask here from Israel is just to use one of those bombs from one of those bombers to knock out that nuclear facility. Um, but of course, I think Trump was really keen on the idea when he thought that they could just drop one bomb and be done with it, and that would, sort of unlock this whole thing. And I think they're starting to realize that that's not really how these things work. And those bombs have actually never been used in warfare before. So it's a sort of hypothetical that it would work. And if it didn't work, right, it would be a huge embarrassment. It would lead to all this insecurity, whatever. So that's partly why I think things are getting a little gummed up. But just to get into some of the other logistics of how things are gummed up right now, obviously there's a concerted effort in Congress to stop this war. It's mostly Democrats, but it's worth noting that a significant part of the MAGA coalition is also really against this. The polling on this is like wildly negative, at 60% to 16%. So basically, a 4x number of people do not want the US to get involved in this war. Um, that's even true for Republicans, where twice as many Republicans don't want a US war with Iran compared to the ones that do. The ones who do is like less than a quarter. So, shockingly unpopular. And again, I do think that in critical ways, Trump is more sensitive to public opinion on these kinds of things than, say, Joe Biden was, who actually was like a sort of, committed ideological Zionist. Whereas Donald Trump doesn't really care about anyone or anything but Donald Trump. But the other piece of this that I think is a key restraining factor here is the underlying economics of it. Like there's a really key way here in which the United States can't afford an escalation of the war in a really meaningful way. Not only because we're already in this like really fragile market condition, right? And we're already seeing oil prices going through the roof and stocks starting to tumble, just from the insecurity about how all of this is playing out. Obviously, if things really did get heated, that means that the Strait of Hormuz, the area between Iran and the UAE, where like more than a quarter or almost a third of the entire world's oil supply goes through, and if that area gets shut down, like the implications for the global machine of capitalism obviously are somewhat devastating. So the like elite that would normally support a war like this have a lot to lose in this particular scenario. And with the US on the brink of recession, right, that makes those things even more problematic. Not to get like too into wonky economics here, but another key piece of this, and I'm sure people are hearing that and being like, yeah, yeah, that was also true for the war in Iraq, and that was also true, when like we invaded Afghanistan, yada yada. And yes, but one particular quirk about like global economics as it relates to the United States being the global hegemon is that when there's this sort of like when the world is thrown into security chaos, money historically, you know, you see like stocks tumble, obviously, but when stocks tumble, it means people are selling their stock and they put their money into something else. And historically, what that something else has been is the US dollar. So people buy government bonds. So this is really weird thing where like for the US government, when they cause global chaos, it actually gives them a new slush fund of money to work with. But that doesn't seem to be the case this time for the first time, maybe ever, because the dollar index, like the value of the dollar relative to other currencies, is collapsing because of Trump's whole tariff thing. So like people actually aren't buying government bonds in a way that they historically used to. And so that slush fund actually doesn't exist. So spending $1 trillion on the war with Iran isn't really something that's conceivable right now, particularly with the fight over the big, beautiful bill or whatever. I want to touch really quickly on how what we're seeing in Iran is also a byproduct, like is a logical consequence of the way that Israel has changed the rules of the game, and the sort of like erosion of norms and the ways that they impact uh, all global conflicts from now on. Thank you, Israel. Um, like we're seeing this sort of like same like broad civilian attacks on civilian infrastructure all across Iran, right? The bombing of health centers and these mass evacuations, including 300,000 people in Tehran. Not to mention Trump's like totally unhinged tweet earlier this week about telling everyone in Iran to evacuate, everyone in Tehran to evacuate. Sorry, leading people to think that something was about to happen. But again, it's just like total nonsense bluster. Trump obviously not aware or understanding that the population of Tehran is bigger than the entire population of Israel. Like again, not getting the scale here at all. Um, but just to say, like, yeah, like the dynamics here, I think are fascinating, and also the ways that those dynamics are now blowing back onto Israel itself, right? Where we saw Israeli officials this week absolutely lose their minds because a hospital was targeted in Israel. And sorry, it wasn't targeted, right? The Iranians actually admitted that it was a mistake, and that hospital, which treats IDF soldiers who were in Gaza, is attached to a military complex. And so the Iranians were like, "Oh, we were trying to hit the military complex and we hit the hospital. Sorry." But like the fact that a hospital got hit at all, caused basically Israelis of all political stripes to be like, "This is a war crime. It needs to be prosecuted as a war crime. What kind of evil people target hospitals?" In like the most tone deaf, like guy in a hot dog suit saying we need to figure out who did this kind of thing, like just shockingly obtuse in terms of their understanding of the fact that they've bombed every single hospital in Gaza, right? Like every single one. But the real thing that stuck out to me this week that I just absolutely relished was earlier after the first round of ballistic missile attacks, somebody put out like a thing making fun of the Israeli claims that like Hezbollah rockets were hidden in apartment buildings in Lebanon, basically showing F-35s hidden in an apartment building. And like the graphic, you should watch it. The graphic like goes on to get increasingly absurd. There's like a submarine in the lobby, and then there's an Imperial Death Star, like Death Destroyer or whatever in the basement. But Israelis took it seriously. And they were like, oh, like, look how bad Iranian propaganda is. And it's like, no, bro, it's your propaganda that's really bad. They're making fun of you. You don't even see it. So, yeah, there's just a lot there that is worth, I don't know, enjoying a moment of, I guess. I just wanted to mention, because we talked a lot about the Samud convoy in the last few weeks, that it's run into quite some troubles in both Libya and Egypt, where protest folks aligned with the government basically are trying to stop them, calling the Samud convoy a trap to put Egypt in particular into an awkward situation, basically acknowledging that they're playing a critical role in this genocide. And so, yeah, they have not made it anywhere near Gaza, unfortunately, and so it's not clear what the future of the Samud convoy is going to be. Wanted to come back to the United States a little bit in our final minutes, just to reflect on one, how dynamics here are changing as a result of a lot of this stuff. This new poll by Quinnipiac, I think, is absolutely fascinating. I think it shows the lowest levels of support for Israel in like US history, and that's particularly true with Democrats who now have a 12% favorability rate with Israelis versus a 60% favorability rate with Palestinians. So it's 5-1 at this point in terms of Democrats realizing, like, oh, yeah, obviously we should support the people who are being genocided and not the people committing the genocide. But again, obviously not reflected in the Democratic political elite yet. But also, this New York Intelligencer article, like the fact that New York Magazine, of all places, published an article this week called Crimes of the Century, talking about the unimaginable hundreds, if not thousands, of war crimes committed by Israel in Gaza. Like again, we're seeing a shifting media and narrative landscape in a way that would have been unthinkable not that long ago. So it's important, I think, to reflect that. And you should give that New York article a read. It's a good one. Meanwhile, of course, the Israel lobby is scrambling to continue Democratic Party support of Israel. They're, issuing talking points everywhere. Unsurprisingly, we're seeing that high-level Democratic politicians like Chuck Schumer and others are kind of quietly actually hoping that um, Trump does attack Iran. And we don't have to go that far to see this. The JCRC Bay Area put out a thing about how it was important to stop Iran and we need to support Israel in this moment, the so-called progressive institution that seems to be keen to further this war. Um, and I think it smacks of this like kind of political desperation, right? Like realizing how unbelievably unpopular that position is, but feeling like they have to take it to protect Israel's interests. Just yuck. Um, I don't just want to like quickly touch on how it's impacting local politics too and national politics. Like the way that the New York Times is describing New York mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani, whose election is coming up this Tuesday, by the way. Uh, not only sort of like the sort of usual nonsense where like the New York Times refuses to endorse him, saying that he doesn't have the instinct for compromise that made Bernie Sanders so effective when if you like look back to what they said 5 years ago, they said compromise is anathema to Sanders. Only his prescriptions. They're like, it's the same argument over and over again ad infinitum. But like, I just wanted to draw attention to the biography of Zohran Mamdani that the New York Times has on its website, like on the page dedicated to the New York mayoral elections. Literally more than half of his entire biography is about his views on Israel, right? It's like, whatever, rousing viral videos, Democratic socialists pursuing out of the box proposals, and then that's it. That's all they've got. And then from there on, drawn criticism from his rivals for being unrealistic about financing. Okay, there's one more. And then, wrong way. Mamdani has been more outspoken than the other candidates in his criticism of Israel's government. He has called Israel's actions in Gaza a genocide. He said of the first primary debate that he believes Israel has a right to exist as, quote, a state. Like, why is all of that? It's a New York mayoral election. Why is the entire thing about Israel? Right? But such it is. Um, and in the context of that, right, and in the ways that that feeds into local fascism, it's just, a couple of things from this week. One, Palantir, Meta, and OpenAI have all joined the US military. Like their chief technology officers and other C-suite folks are now in this detachment of the US Army called Detachment 201, where they can like more directly influence military policy. Just a terrifying development. Just another reminder if you use ChatGPT to not. And I don't normally quote the Daily Show here, but I thought this episode did a really good job of how getting into how even the MAGA movement that's against war with Iran is like against war with Iran because they want domestic war, right? Like we shouldn't be sending troops to Tehran, but we should be sending troops to Los Angeles, to like attack Democrats and immigrants. And there's so much there to unpack, but we are already at time, so I will just close with the response to some of that fascism stuff, which is, this amazing piece by Max Elbaum this week about a path to pushing MAGA out of power, really kind of concretizing some of the steps that need to be taken in this like anti-fascist moment. This article in the Monthly Review, also by John Bellamy Foster, I think is a wonderful examination of what the isolationist wing of the MAGA party looks like and what it means. And so to sum up, obviously things in Gaza
Cameron,
are really,
before you sum
yo,
up, I do want to kind of break news. It's been broken for a few little while now while we're on the program, but I just got a text from our dear friend and comrade from the Center for Constitutional Rights that Mahmoud Khalil has the order has been made to free him, and so I'm just going to drop that in the chat for folks to check out CCR's press release on that. A little bit of good news amidst all of everything else.
Yeah.
And
Thanks
back
for
to
that
you.
reminder, Thomas. I actually saw that news right before we started and then meant to include it and completely forgot. So just to close out, obviously things in Gaza are very bad, but I think people are using that as an excuse not to pay attention. So we really need to keep Gaza in the frame. Um, the like prospects of a war are very high, despite my saying that I don't think the U.S. is going to involve itself, and me saying I could be wrong about that. A lot is going to depend on these next 2 weeks and what happens in those 2 weeks in terms of making sure that that doesn't happen. Um, and yeah, just, like we have to keep up that fight and we have to make sure that we understand how those pieces all fit together in terms of stopping the war in Iran, stopping the genocide in Palestine, stopping the rise of fascism here, all one fight, and understanding the ways that those fights intersect and overlap. Really critical. And so, upcoming events and actions. Of course, there is a big No War on Iran rally today, this afternoon. I hope to see you there at the Federal Building. Next Thursday, there's an action in front of Palantir, which has been a key player in both the rise of Trump and the genocide in Gaza. Again, talking about those connections. If you want to hear about other events, please check out the AROC events calendar at bit.ly/Gaza events. You can get text messages by texting PSA to 833-633-0604. And you can check out the PAL Media Tracker for articles that inform this analysis. You can sign up for the newsletter at palmediatracker.com/sign up. Thank you.
Thanks, Sammer. You mentioned the Daily Show, and I thought if this works, I'd like to do a little bit of a moment of Zen, since there is something, one moment of levity. There always seem to be these gaffes that the U.S. ambassador or U.S. officials make when talking about Israel, and there was one such blunder today at the Security Council meeting that I think was worth listening to.
Israel's government has also spread chaos, terror, and suffering throughout the region. Iran's government has also spread chaos, terror, and suffering throughout the region.
Yes, yes. I know that there's a lot going on. We hope folks show up for the actions. Some good news today to wrap up. We'll be back. We'll stick around for just a few minutes to answer some questions. But Samra, thanks again